One thing we have to be careful of, as I've summarized this from the Joseph Smith papers, is our sources on plural marriage. We can only form our conception of the past based on the sources that exist. And they're just simply because of the secretive, private nature of plural marriage, that it wasn't taught and practiced openly in Nauvoo. Nauvoo plural marriage is actually more difficult to piece together than the Utah practice of plural marriage. Therefore, we actually know less about Joseph Smith's practice of it than Brigham and the Utah practice of plural marriage. Editors of the Joseph Smith papers point out, quote, most of the information on the practice during this Nauvoo period comes either from later affidavits and reminiscences or from reports of disaffected members of the church at the time, none of which, for a variety of reasons, can be considered entirely reliable historical sources for delineating how plural marriage was understood and practiced by those involved at the time. I guess what I'm trying to say is anybody who is a little too definitive or too we know exactly what went on with Nauvoo and plural marriage, I take that with a grain of salt, and I hope that I'm not coming across as too definitive in this video either. For example, we know from a later affidavit that Joseph Smith likely married Lucy Walker. He married Lucy Walker on May 1st, 1843. Well, if you go to Joseph Smith's journal for May 1st, 1843, he doesn't say anything about it. He just says he went out in the forenoon and came back in the afternoon. When he went out, that's probably when the marriage occurred. We know of this marriage because of a later affidavit from Lucy Walker herself that was sworn in 1902, as you're seeing here, that she married Joseph on the first day of May, 1843, by Elder William Clayton. She says, the prophet was then living with his first wife, Emma, and I know that she gave her consent to the marriage of at least 4 women to her husband as plural wives. And so this is one example of a pretty good source of why we know that Joseph, coming from Lucy Walker herself, saying that I married Joseph Smith. There are other good sources, like we have a lot of good sources that Eliza Partridge probably married Joseph Smith. We have all these listed here, and this one signed by Eliza herself. But there are others that just aren't quite so clear as a whole. And so one time I went to a colleague of mine at BYU and said, okay, when I teach this, he's one of the church's leading experts on Joseph Smith's practice of plural marriage. I said, when I teach this, I want to make sure I'm accurate on it. How many women was Joseph married or sealed to in his lifetime? And he said, well, it depends on the sources because some of them are more credible than others, and it's just hard to piece it together. I said, well, how many would you say? And he goes, there's probably 10 sources for 10 women that it's pretty definitive that Joseph married in his lifetime. And he goes, there's sources for about 10 others that makes it possible. And then there's some hints at maybe 10 others, but not quite as strong. And I said, so 30? And he goes, no, I would say that there are good, strong sources for 10, possible sources for... That's how good historians approach Joseph Smith's practice of plural marriage. They try to base it off good, reliable sources. Although historians are unsure, it's likely that Joseph may have married his first wife, a woman named Fanny Alger, sometime in Kirtland between 1833 and 35. It's not known if Emma knew about the marriage beforehand or after or when she learned about it. It likely leads to Oliver Cowdery accusing Joseph Smith of adultery and Joseph saying that he wouldn't commit adultery and trying to teach Oliver about plural marriage. If Joseph did marry her, there's not extremely strong sources on it. And that might lead to some of Joseph's hesitations, that there's no indications that he enters into any other plural marriages during the Kirtland period. It's not until the Nauvoo period that he begins to enter into plural marriages again. As I mentioned, although the numbers are unsure, it's maybe there's evidence that Joseph may have been married or sealed to about 30 women during his lifetime. That's from the church's own essay on the subject. If you use people's different lists, and just to be clear about this, it all depends how people frame things. And I understand that I'm framing it in a certain way, but sometimes people will say they'll want to focus in on Joseph Smith's younger wives. And Joseph did marry, his youngest wife was Helen Mar Kimball. He was sealed to her, who was at the age of 14, and that he married a few others who were in their teens. But he also married women who were in their 50s and others of every age in between. If you use Todd Compton's list, the average age of Joseph Smith's wives that he married was 28 years old. The oldest was likely Rhoda Richards, who was 58, and Fanny Young, who was 56. None of Joseph's contemporaries, anyway, raise an issue of the ages of his wives, of either being too old or too young at the time. Well, speaking of Joseph's hesitancy, there are a number of later reminiscences that Joseph hesitated to implement this revelation. Most revelations from God, Joseph moved right into it. This one he seemed to have a lot of hesitation about. Brian Hales has documented there's at least 20 reminiscences of an angel with a drawn sword coming to Joseph Smith, commanding him that he needed to implement the practice or that he would lose his prophetic mantle, calling, position, however you want to say it. These are later reminiscences. I want to be clear. The earliest one is 1853. The latest is 1905. And so here's just a few of them. Eliza R. Snow, Joseph Smith received the revelation in 1837, but was himself afraid to promulgate it until the angel came and stood beside him with a flaming sword and bade him to do the command of God. Not until then did Joseph enter into polygamy. Zina Huntington, Zina D. Young told of Brother Joseph's remark in relation to the revelation on plural marriage, how an angel came to him with a drawn sword and said if he did not obey this law, he would lose his priesthood. And in the keeping of it, Joseph did not know, but it would cost him his life. Or Helen Mar Kimball. This fact, plural marriage, the Lord revealed to his prophet Joseph Smith as early as the year 1831. And yet, had it not been for the fear of his displeasure, Joseph would have shrunk from the undertaking and would have continued silent, as he did for years, until an angel of the Lord threatened to slay him if he did not reveal and establish this celestial principle. There's some of the sources on it. Joseph marries most of his wives in the Nauvoo period after he gets out of Liberty Jail. And into 1844, Joseph Smith did not enter into more plural marriages at that time. One of the biggest questions people have is why? Why did Joseph do it in private? Why wasn't he public and open about it? And being transparent, sometimes Joseph publicly denied that the practice of polygamy that was happening as well. Now, this is how the book Saints summarizes it. Joseph felt an urgency to teach plural marriage to the saints, despite the risks of his own reservations. If he introduced the principle privately to faithful men and women, he could build strong support for it, preparing for the time when it could be taught openly. To accept plural marriage, people would have to overcome their prejudices, reconsider social customs, and exercise great faith to obey God when he commanded something so foreign to their traditions. That might be some of the reasons why it was done in private. I just think Joseph knew of the difficulty that it would cause and bring about upon his people as a whole. It was difficult enough when it was announced in public and we were out in Utah, really on our own, all by ourselves. It still caused so much difficulty for the church during the 1850s, all the way through the 1890s, up to the end of it.